Hello, this is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us via Zoom Mike Radzilowsky. He is a tenant attorney and he has some interesting information that might help some of our listeners. Welcome, Michael. Could you first tell us a little
I
bit?
don't know what somehow, how come I'm twisted?
Uh, let's Could you turn your phone sideways? There we
Not
go.
my phone, it's my,
Oh,
okay,
iPad. Oh,
okay. Now I think I'm okay.
okay.
I've got my iPad
Yes.
and yeah, my name is Mike Radzilowsky. I'm
Mhm.
an attorney. I practice law for over 50 years in Cook County. And right now, from a tenant's point of view, there's some exciting opportunities. And contrary to what most people think, most of those opportunities can only be taken advantage of is if your landlord sues you for eviction saying you owe rent, because then what can happen is that you can apply through a couple of city and county programs to have your rent paid by the government. I
Mhm.
mean, this is money that was left over from the pandemic.
Mhm.
The Joe Biden gave the city of Chicago an incredible amount of money, and they at first thought they could use it for like rehabbing housing or doing other things. And when they found out that the only thing they could do with the money was to pay it out to tenants, they were like 2 years into the process.
Mhm.
So they still have money to help people who can't pay their rent. And they're not really at this point fighting very hard not to qualify people. In fact, they want to spend the money.
So, what happened? Is this federal money that was given to Chicago, and then Chicago misunderstood how it was to be spent, that they were helping the landlords, the
Yeah, they were
landlords?
trying to help landlords. They were trying to do some other programs, and then they got zapped because there were some advocates that said, no, the only thing you can do with this money is give it to tenants who are in danger of losing their apartment.
Mhm. And how many are there out there? Are there any numbers about how many people are in need?
Well, at this point, it turns out that everybody who I have submitted as being in need and who has an eviction filed against them, as long as the paperwork is filled out, they get the money.
Mhm. And
And there's a couple of ways it can be done. One is that if, let's say, someone's 3 months behind, but if they have a shitty landlord, I can work it out where we'll give the landlord 6 months worth of rent, and the tenant agrees to leave in 3 more months. So it gives the tenant like an additional 3 months to leave.
mhm.
Now, I've even had situations where the maximum that can be given to an individual tenant is $25,000.
Mm.
So I'll have people who owe for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, and it can be done. Like I said, it can be done either way. One is we negotiate with the landlord for the repairs that they will do with the money they get.
Mm. Mhm.
And that's if you want to
So,
stay with your landlord.
so
But if you,
in other words, before that money did not have the tenant in the equation. It was just given to the landlords to use for repairs. But later the city, who was it?
the
The
federal,
advocates.
it's the federal government and the state both have programs that provide relief for tenants. The purpose of both of the programs is to prevent homelessness.
Mhm. And the advocates, did they file a lawsuit in court to stop that money from being used for the landlords?
They didn't have to. The Biden administration ruled in their favor and refused to reimburse the city for money they spent for other things.
So how much money has been spent that the city now cannot spend? Do they owe that money now? Did they spend it
No, no,
out and now?
the city at this point has not received any money that they have to give back.
Uh,
There's just a large amount of money that hasn't been spent, and the city is eagerly trying to spend it.
uh-huh. But the money that was there was money that was spent on the landlords, right? But then or
Well, what it was that the city spent money on landlords,
mhm,
and then they were told by the Biden administration that that money would not be reimbursed from federal funds.
mm.
That the
Oh, okay.
only way the city could get the money that was being put up was to give it actually for tenant rent.
So do you know how much is out of the city of Chicago's coffers now, since they spent the money
Well,
expecting to be
my
reimbursed?
understanding is that it started at $15 billion,
Mhm.
and there's still almost half of the money left.
So did the city spend $7.5 billion
No,
that
no,
is
the
not being
city hasn't
reimbursed?
spent. No, at this point, the city, I think, spent a couple $1 billion
Mhm.
on programs that the federal government and the state said were inappropriate.
Mhm.
All of that, they're not being reimbursed that money. The
Oh,
money that is there can only be used to help alleviate homelessness by
mhm.
tenants.
Got it.
And apparently the rules have been kind of loosened. I mean, as an example, it used to be like if someone was looking for a subsidized apartment,
Mhm.
the rules were pretty strict about how you could qualify. They now have a provision that to get a subsidized apartment, people have to show that their net income is over 62, less than $62,000.
Mhm.
That means, and a lot of people have things like medical expenses. They have, um, let's say you have a kid who has a problem that they're spending money on. You need to get like a van for your son or daughter to go to a particular place, to get treatment. Those monies don't count against what you're entitled to as a subsidy.
Mm.
So I don't know if I can say it's basically pretty close to a golden age for tenants who have a need for money.
Mhm. Okay, so in other words, that that money uh that that qualifies as income uh
Well,
for the
it's a qualify. I mean, what you had is they were very strict about what income you could have,
right.
but what they have done is in determining your income, you're allowed to exclude the money that you spend. Let's say you have a child who has special needs. The
Mhm.
money you spend on those special needs does not count as income.
Mhm.
The money that you spend on your health care does not count as income.
Mhm.
So for a lot of people, even if they're, let's say they get a salary of 100,000 a year, they still qualify because they have large exemptions.
Mhm. Mhm. And
And
these are the new rules now for that
yeah, this is the
extra
new
money.
rules. This has been
Yes.
the last 3 or 4 months.
Mhm.
And so you have two levels of programming. The problem you still have is that there isn't enough subsidized housing,
Mhm.
so that so people still have a problem finding a place to live that qualify, even though they can receive all sorts of help financially.
Mhm. Well, then, what about the landlords? Do they have to have some there some apartments set aside as subsidized housing in order to for these people to move in, or could
Well, that,
any tenant?
that's the issue of set asides in buildings. That's
Okay.
a separate issue from the other two. I mean, many landlords got money from the government to build housing on the understanding that they would have a certain number of units that had to qualify economically.
Hmm.
But at this point, they don't. The landlords have a lot of landlords got away without having to do that.
Hmm.
You know,
Right.
they got the subsidies, they got the ribbons cut, the politicians stood with them, but the money that they received didn't go for the purposes it was intended.
So is that illegal, or did how
It's
are they able to get away
well, let's
from it?
put it this way. That is illegal, but it's not something that the government, people working with the government have really, done their homework on to protect the tenants. They just simply have allowed a lot of landlords to get away with doing things that are illegal.
In other words, you're saying that they the landlords are doing things illegal. They get the money for set asides without actually having the set asides for tenants. However, there is no enforcement. But if there were enforcement, who is supposed to be doing the enforcement?
Well, I mean, it's curious because you have a couple of organizations who have done a pretty good job of enforcing the law, and they've kind of been, I don't know, bought off is quite the right word, but those like Access to Living gets government money to help hire their staff, so they're not running around looking for landlords to zap. They're looking around for programs that that they can get funded.
Mhm.
So very little is being done to really help the tenant. Most of it is, most of the landlords, there's been an effort to build the housing.
Mhm.
There's even this new effort that the city is trying to do where if the housing is worth over $1 million, they raise the amount of money that has to be put into a special fund for doing work. But even there isn't there hasn't really been an aggressive enforcement of what they should be doing with that money.
So the homes or the apartments that are worth over $1 million, they have to set aside some funds into they have to pay into a fund. Is that what you're saying? And
No,
that
they have to pay a higher. There's like there's a tax that the city imposes on units,
mhm.
and if your unit is worth over $1 million, you have to pay tax at a higher rate,
Oh,
and that money goes into a fund that the city is supposed to use to provide more affordable housing.
uh-huh.
And at this point, I don't think that they have done a very good job of enforcing that provision.
So this program is separate from the Bring
Yeah,
Chicago Home
it's a new
Ordinance.
program. It's separate. It's something the aldermen have put together, and that money is supposed to be used to provide for affordable housing.
Mhm.
And
So this is
well, I mean, and part of the problem is that what people consider affordable and what it costs to provide those units hasn't realistically been assessed. I
mhm.
mean, it costs a lot more money to provide units that meet these requirements. But at the same time, that does not excuse non-compliance with the law.
And this money that's being set aside to build more affordable units. This is separate from that Bring Chicago Home Ordinance that the voters will be voting on, in which the any unit or home that is worth over $1 million, if they sell it, then they.
That's part of the program, that when the sales of over $1 million occur, the extra money that is raised by those sales has to be put into a fund that will be utilized to provide more affordable housing. And when you look at what makes housing affordable, a lot of people don't realize that you can consider things like you have kids with special needs. Those special needs are things that you can apply the money that you get in this fashion to help the family. So that means that someone who, if they're paying full market, could be paying several, $3,000 or $4,000 in rent, could only be required to pay $1,200 in rent, because the rest of the things should be covered with affordable housing provisions.
And these $1 million units, are you talking about units that are being rented out, and those the value, the market value of those units? How do they calculate the $1 million?
It's when it's a market value thing. If the person is trying to sell a unit and they're receiving more than $1 million for the unit, then it counts towards this program.
So this is separate from the Bring Chicago Home Ordinance, because that is supposedly not in effect yet. The voters still have to vote on it, but the votes sound pretty much the same.
I'm sorry. This is a provision that's coming up. Right now, like I said, you have a situation in Illinois that between the federal government and the state government, several trillion, basically several $1 billion were supposed to be set aside to help people who would otherwise lose their apartment. The city originally didn't enforce the law the way it was intended. So now there's a fairly healthy pot of money. But the only problem for the tenant is someone has to start they have to be under threat of eviction.
And when you mentioned that the city didn't enforce the law as it was intended, what law are we talking about?
We're talking about the pandemic homelessness laws. And there was also some money from the state government that the state got a bunch of money, and they gave some of it to the city of Chicago, and the city of Chicago got its own money. So both of those pools of money are still available.
And a lot of that money that was geared toward the tenants actually got spent on the landlords. So you said that about maybe $7.5 billion was spent on the landlords, and none of
I don't know the exact dollar figure, but I'm saying that of the money that was allocated, there is still a relatively, I think about half of it still hasn't been paid out. And that's what but the only way people can take advantage of that money is basically to have the landlord sue them for eviction, and then have the landlord's rent costs basically subsidized by the city. And what I've done, and when I've worked with people on this, is I give my clients a choice. If they want to stay with that landlord, then what we do is try to write in provision that the landlord has to do certain things to the apartment in order to get the money. If my tenant wants to get away from the landlord, then we just like add some months that my tenant can live there without paying rent. And the deal is that the landlord gets that money, but the tenant has to leave within that extended period of time.
Mhm. Yes, but it is interesting. Then, since the city misallocated the money, it's like a lot of the RFPs when organizations use money, they have to use their own money, but then be reimbursed. So, what the city used for the landlords, they're not going to be reimbursed for it. So they're in a hole for the money that they spent.
I think so. Yeah.
Mhm. For those tenants, when they uh, do you know how many tenants have received money? How many how what money is still
I
available?
could get you the figures. They have to file quarterly reports, but I do know that there's significant money that's left. I mean, if you walked in tomorrow and you hadn't paid your rent for 6 months and you walked into my office, I could file an application. Your landlord would sue you for eviction. I'd call the landlord's attorney up and we would then work out a deal
Mhm.
that would prevent you from being homeless.
Right. Yeah, the attorneys, yeah, I know they try to work out a deal instead of having to go to court. This is
No, they
WZRD.
have, but in this case, there has to be an eviction filed. You can't,
Oh,
the lawyers just can't agree to each stuff. And that's the hard thing for a lot of people to say, well, I've never been evicted in my life, and I don't want to ever be in part of an eviction lawsuit. And I'm trying to tell them that the only way I can get you money is if you go this route.
mhm. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM, and we have with us Michael Radzilowsky, a tenant lawyer telling us about a lot of issues that affect our current situation with tenants. With uh, with these tenants that need to get money to not be evicted. What numbers are we talking about? Is it a huge number of people? Do we have any idea about who
Well,
needs that money and who has applied?
what happens is the underbelly of our system is that probably 30 to 40% of the tenants face eviction during a year.
You mean 30 to 40% of all tenants in the city of Chicago face eviction?
Yeah, that they're in a position where they can't pay their rent and
Mhm,
they are threatened with eviction.
mhm. Wow, that is a huge number. And have you?
And it disproportionately is single women with children. So,
Mhm. And do you think that does it seem as if these are only the probably the reported numbers, and there might be even more?
yeah, I don't, I think that those are fairly accurate
Got it.
numbers of people who, because but where they are underreported is you have women with children who represent a large proportion of the people who are facing and threatened with eviction.
These women with children, how are they able to access resources? How could they find you? How are they able to start the process if they're in danger of being evicted?
Well, I mean, if they're in danger of being evicted, to reach me, you would just you would go to my website, or you just Google Radzilowsky, and you could come in and see me. And sometimes I even have to educate the landlord's attorneys as to why it's desirable for them to help their people get money rather than, them look upon this as like a punitive last resort.
And when did this program start? When did the federal government stop giving money to the
It
landlords?
started when the pandemic started, but it has not. The first 2 years, it was just in a deep freeze because nobody was being evicted.
Mhm. Okay, so in 2020 and 2021,
21.
those the landlords were getting money from the city, and then after 2021, the federal government stopped the practice and said that the money has to go to tenants.
I don't know if it's as direct as that, but what happened was there was a moratorium on evicting people. You could, even if the tenant owed you money, you could not get them out of the apartment. There was a 2-year period, and that's the period where, a lot of landlords, I think they took a hit. But at this particular point, I don't think a landlord is going to take a hit as far as people owing money, because they'll get it reimbursed.
Mm-hmm. So the landlords are pretty much not going to be affected by not going to be affected. They'll get their money, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they'll end up getting their money because we're going to work it out so that the tenant gets to figure out, do they want to stay in this apartment? Do they want to leave? And once that is worked out, then the landlord will get the money so that they don't end up on the wrong side of anything, and the tenant gets to do what they want to do.
In what situations would a tenant fall through the cracks and not get the money?
If the landlord under law does not have an obligation to participate in the program. So there are a handful of landlords that said, no, I just want him out. He didn't pay me money. I don't want the money from the government. I just want him out. And ultimately, in that situation, the landlord could force the person to be evicted. However, most of the judges, kind of make it hard for a landlord to turn down a year's worth of rent to evict the tenant, because
so the judge is able to force the landlord to take the money and keep the
they're not able to force the landlord to take the money, but the incentives in the system are such that it would be very foolish for the landlord not to take the money if the alternative is it's going to take you a year to evict the tenant. You're going to get nothing.
So the tenants, there are not many situations in which a tenant could fall into the cracks and not receive this money if they're in a danger of being evicted, is what you mean.
If we're talking about a 5-day notice, you didn't pay your rent. There may be some situations which involve a 10-day notice where a tenant does something that affects the habitability of the apartment for not only themselves, but the other tenants. And those cases can proceed.
Got it.
But what we have is a situation that almost every tenant should be able to get basically a year to get their stuff together without being evicted.
And let's say they do get the money and they are able to stay for another year or a couple of months. Do you have any idea about what their financial situation is, that are even if they have this money, are they able to get a new apartment with the rents being so high? How have you heard, have you had any insight about how difficult it is to find housing, since even though they're not being evicted now?
It has been very difficult for people to find decent housing. The real question is that how much would you have to pay for the housing? And that has not been totally worked out yet, because obviously there are more people whose needs, exceed, the market value of these properties. And that hasn't been totally worked out, but it is a lot closer to what you'd want to see than it was 2 years ago.
And
So,
Do you know about any fraud? Is there any because fraud gets into everything that's a grant. Do you know of how people might defraud the system uh, with this money?
Well, I mean, there can be people who could pay their rent who don't pay their rent.
Hmm. Right.
That's the main element of fraud. I think it's very difficult for the landlord to be able to get money for an apartment if no one's living there. I mean,
Hmm.
that just is there aren't too many situations like that. But no, it's there could be some fraud, but given what we faced in the last 30, 40 years, I don't think that the fraud that you would see is anything close to what we've already lived with.
And right now, what is the enforcement arm? Is it the courts that are overseeing the process so that the money goes to whomever it needs to go to?
Yeah, I think the courts have been overseeing the process,
Hmm.
and I even had a couple of situations where, to my surprise, the thing ended up working out because my tenant didn't come back to me and say, "Hey, they're trying to game me. They haven't given me what I'm entitled to."
Hmm.
Everybody, everybody who's been through the process has come back and said, "Yeah, I'm satisfied."
Hmm. What about some seniors? Let's say they need to uh, their health is not good, and how could they avoid the trap of being in nursing homes if they want to remain in their own
Well,
apartments?
well, that's a separate sort of issue. There's a good organization with Fran Tobin, who's the head of it, who came from Rogers Park. And what it basically shows is that it is much cheaper for people to have their own private housing than to be in a nursing home.
What's
There's
the
like
name of
about
the organization?
I,
Oh, that's
I
okay.
should know it, but
No,
I know Fran Tobin
me
is in
too.
charge of it, and
Mhm.
so if anybody Google's Fran Tobin, they'll be able to find that organization. But it's like
Northside
national in
something.
scope now,
Mhm.
and what happens is that these these people who do the nursing homes, it's a scandal. They're taking they're getting 30 or 40% more for the housing than if people were housed privately.
Mhm.
And they're
Yeah.
fighting, and basically the nursing home people are fighting to keep their money,
Mhm.
and everybody knows they're not very good because lawyers prize the cases they can get where somebody is hurt in a nursing home
Mhm.
because they make pretty good awards in those cases.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us Mike Radzilowsky, tenant lawyer. So the what you're saying is that the nursing homes when they get a resident, they're charging that resident 30 to 40% more in rent than if that a resident were able to
Well,
stay in their own homes.
the system is paying that. I don't know
Mhm.
if the tenant is always the one that has the money to pay it, but the government and whoever is subsidizing that tenant is paying 30 or 40% more for housing that person. And that's why these nursing homes, basically exist and try to keep getting what they need.
Mhm. Well, how could an individual avoid ending up in a nursing home? What about home care? Do you know of any solutions where a an ill resident can avoid being in a nursing home and stay at home?
Well, I mean, I know that there are a number of situations that are like that. I would at this point have to refer you to Fran Tobin, who is like that's his full time job is making sure people don't get taken advantage by nursing homes.
Mhm. And you mentioned earlier too that nursing homes face a lot of lawsuits from injured patients, neglected patients, but they're still able to stay in business. Do you have any insight about that?
Well, it's the way our governmental system has worked. You know, if you look at health care, if you look at how people are housed, that the people who are doing it are making a profit, and the people, and what they do is that they take care of the governmental officials who are supposed to be supervising them, so that their profit doesn't get taken away.
Got it. There is a case of one of our friends that had a condo, and then the board at the condo was agreed to sell the building. And when they sold the building, she lost her unit and was only reimbursed half of its market value. Are there many situations like that now?
Are
And
you
what?
talking about in Chicago?
Yes, in Rogers Park. Is
Okay.
there anything that the condo owner could have done to uh,
Well,
retain her unit or at least get market value
well,
for it?
the Chicago ordinance, which is a pretty good one, so protects the tenant, because you before your unit can be, I mean, there are going to be instances, let's say, where the land, somebody has really fixed up their unit
Mhm,
so that it's worth more than the market value. And since the case of getting that, your unit reimbursed, is done at what is supposed to be market value, there are people who are going to get screwed, but for the most part, you should be able to get them the additional money that you put in out.
mhm. So you're saying that our friend, she put her life savings, she used her condo as a nest egg for her retirement savings. And then
Right.
when it was sold for half its market value, she lost half of her lifetime savings, in other words. So uh,
I
I
mean, if
think that
someone had aggressively pursued her rights in that situation,
mhm,
there should have been some allowance for the additional things she had put into it.
mhm. In other words, there is an ordinance that protects the condo owners from a sale like that, that they should.
It's supposed to protect them, and it's like you have to, first of all, have to have 85% of the unit owners agree to do what is being done. And you also, I think, you have to give the people with those units the, I think there is even like a right of, if they have to have the market price has to be something that is fair. I mean, if it's not fair, then I think the person can come in and just buy it back.
So you're saying that this person, since she got undersold, she lost half of the value, she could still fight for
I think
that.
she should have fought for more compensation because of the special circumstances of her unit.
Mhm.
But I mean, I don't know that you, at this point, I don't know whether it's already too late or not. I
Mhm.
mean,
Right.
there's a certain, at a certain point, you can fight for things, but you have to do it in a timely fashion.
Exactly. And what legal standing would she have? Is it a Chicago ordinance? Is it
Yeah,
what
that
type?
you have the Chicago tenant condo ordinance should have given her standing to make sure that she got a fair market price.
Mhm. I mean, I'm not sure how many people voted it down, if it were 85% or not, but I know that the board voted, and she did not get a chance to have her say, and then I'm not absolutely sure about the number. But let's say if there were 85%, if the board was able to convince 85% of the property owners to vote for the sale of the building at that low price.
I mean, that's why it's hard to imagine a situation where where that woman you couldn't have had the people on the board for their own protection to make sure she got a fair shake.
Well, yeah, she did mention that the board, some of the board were approached by the buyer, and they got some compensation in order to vote the way they did. But of course, this is hearsay. But pretty much that's what happened. That's why it was voted that way.
Okay.
Okay. Well.
Well, I think I'm sorry. I think I have to get going.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
happy to come back at a later date
Yes,
and we'll set it
definitely.
up.
Yes.
It's been very good talking with you because you seem to be very knowledgeable on these issues. And so it makes it a lot easier to discuss.
Well, thank you, Mike Radzilowsky, tenant attorney. And if our listeners want to contact you or learn more about you, what should they do?
Just go online to the just put Radzilowsky, Radzilowsky. Just put in your Google search for attorney Rad. I mean, I'm the only attorney Radzilowsky in the book.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us and giving us so much useful information. Thank you so much.
And thank you for the opportunity. Take care. Bye-bye.